The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin as passengers settled in. Malcolm Hayes walked in with steady steps, carrying only a small carry-on bag. His expression was calm, but observant. He found his seat by the window and sat down quietly. Pulling a book from his pocket, he began to read, oblivious to the movement around him. Minutes later, Margaret Sinclair entered the cabin, a woman of imposing presence dressed in fine clothes and discreet yet expensive jewelry. Her face carried the expression of someone used to being served, to having everything according to her will. When she saw Malcolm sitting beside her seat, she stopped abruptly, furrowing her brow. Her gaze scanned every detail of the man, and something inside her tensed. She quickly checked her ticket. Surely there was a mistake. Stewardess. Her voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. The flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "How may I assist you, ma'am?" "This is my seat, but I believe there has been a mistake with this man's seat." Margaret frowned as if Malcolm's mere presence was an offense. He must belong in economy class, not here. Malcolm continued flipping through his book, unaffected, while the tension in the cabin grew. Get ready. This story of prejudice, irony, and empathy will surprise you. Leave a like on this video and comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to see new videos. The flight attendant glanced at her tablet and confirmed that the seating arrangement was correct. "There is no mistake, ma'am. Your seat is indeed here, and the gentleman's seat is correct as well." Margaret's lips pressed together. She would not accept this easily. "This is ridiculous. This seat costs a fortune." She looked around, expecting support from other passengers. "I have been a loyal customer of this airline for years. Do you really expect me to accept this?" The flight attendant blinked, surprised. Nearby passengers began to take notice. Some cast discreet glances, while others stared openly. The discomfort was palpable. "Ma'am, unfortunately the flight is full. All first-class seats are occupied." "This is outrageous," Margaret exclaimed, raising her voice slightly. "I always fly with this airline, and I have never experienced anything like this." Malcolm finally lifted his eyes, meeting hers. His gaze was calm but carried a silent weight, the weariness of someone who had faced looks like that countless times before. "It's all right, stewardess," he said, closing his book calmly. Then he met Margaret's gaze with steady resolve. "Ma'am, first class offers plenty of space, but it seems to me that the issue here isn't the seating arrangement, it's who is sitting beside you. Just so you know, I paid just as much as you did for this seat, and I'm not going anywhere. But don't worry, I don't intend to speak to you. After all, some conversations aren't worth the effort." But Margaret didn't even look at him. Her slender fingers clenched her purse tightly, as if she needed to hold on to something to reaffirm her indignation. The discomfort on her face was unmistakable. "I just think this isn't his place." Her voice was low but sharp, dripping with disdain. "These airlines are really losing their standards." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. A passenger in the next row averted his gaze, another just sighed. The flight attendant took a deep breath, maintaining her professionalism. "Ma'am, Mr. Hayes has just as much right to this seat as any other passenger. Please take your seat so we can proceed with the flight." Margaret hesitated. Her eyes flashed as if waiting for someone to take her side. But there was no alternative. Her face flushed with anger and frustration. Muttering under her breath, she finally sat down, turning her body sharply in the opposite direction, as if the mere proximity was unbearable. The plane taxied down the runway, ready for takeoff, but inside first class, the real conflict had already begun. The plane had been in the air for a few minutes, but the tension among the first-class passengers remained thick. Margaret kept her arms crossed, her features rigid, eyes fixed on the screen in front of her, as if any movement beside her might contaminate her. Her discomfort was evident, but Malcolm seemed indifferent. He remained calm, flipping through his book leisurely, unaffected by the occasional sideways glances the woman still cast his way. The flight attendant passed by serving drinks. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" she asked politely. "Red wine, the best you have," Margaret replied without even looking at her. The flight attendant turned to Malcolm. "And for you, sir?" He offered a slight smile. Just water, please. As the flight attendant walked away, Margaret let out a quiet, sarcastic chuckle. Of course, she muttered, barely audible. Malcolm didn't react, but a nearby passenger noticed and frowned, watching the scene attentively. Time passed slowly. Margaret tried to distract herself, but she couldn't ignore Malcolm's presence. He did nothing but read, and yet his mere existence seemed to bother her deeply. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable, sipping her wine in short, impatient gulps. Even his silence felt like an affront. After a while, she couldn't hold back and let out an irritated sigh, shaking her head. Unbelievable, she whispered. Malcolm lifted his eyes from the book and looked directly at her. Is there a problem, ma'am? His voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. Margaret hesitated for a moment, then turned her face away, pretending not to have heard. The silence in the first-class cabin was interrupted by heavy breathing. Margaret Sinclair shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the strange sensation spreading through her chest. The discomfort that had been purely emotional now turned physical. A light dizziness clouded her head, and a cold sweat trickled down the back of her neck. She blinked repeatedly, trying to clear her blurred vision. A tight, suffocating pressure gripped her chest. She attempted to adjust herself in her seat to shake it off, but the pain intensified, radiating down her left arm. The discomfort quickly turned into panic. I don't feel well. Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. A flight attendant noticed the sudden change in her expression and quickly approached. Ma'am, are you all right? She asked, leaning in with concern. Margaret tried to respond, but her breathing became labored. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the armrest. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Murmurs arose around the cabin as some passengers began to take notice. Someone call for a doctor, a voice echoed through the cabin. The flight attendant, now visibly alarmed, scanned the area. Is there a doctor on board? She called out urgently. The commotion spread. Passengers turned, trying to grasp the situation. That was when a deep, steady voice cut through the chaos. I'm a doctor. Let me through immediately. All eyes turned toward Malcolm Hayes, who was already rising from his seat. The murmur of voices filled the cabin. Passengers leaned forward to get a better view as the flight attendant stepped back to make room. Malcolm Hayes walked steadily toward Margaret Sinclair, who was now struggling to breathe. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. Mrs. Sinclair, can you hear me? Malcolm asked, his voice calm but firm. Margaret lifted her eyes, and for a brief moment the fear on her face overshadowed her pride. She tried to speak, but the pain stopped her. I need space and the aircraft's first aid kit now, Malcolm ordered, crouching beside her. The flight attendant nodded quickly and rushed to retrieve the equipment. Silence fell over the cabin. The disdain and distrust Margaret had shown earlier had turned into vulnerability. Now, her life was in the hands of the very man she had so openly disregarded. Malcolm placed his fingers on her wrist, feeling her weak and irregular pulse. Your blood pressure is dropping. Try to stay calm and breathe slowly, he instructed, quickly assessing her symptoms. The flight attendant returned with the emergency kit and a portable defibrillator. Malcolm opened it swiftly, retrieving the necessary items. Margaret, unable to resist, could only watch, her breathing shallow and her eyes glistening with fear. You're going to be okay, but I need you to trust me, Malcolm assured her, his voice steady with confidence. The entire cabin held its breath as he worked, the fate of Margaret now resting in the hands of the man she had dismissed just minutes before. The plane landed smoothly on the runway, but inside the first-class cabin, the tension still lingered in the air. Margaret Sinclair looked visibly shaken, her face reflecting not only the physical distress, but also the weight of what had just happened. Still catching her breath, she slowly turned toward Malcolm Hayes, who was calmly gathering the last of the medical equipment with the same composure he had maintained the entire time. For a moment, she simply watched him. The man who had just saved her life was the same one she had openly dismissed without even knowing him. Doctor, Margaret began hesitantly. Her voice, once filled with arrogance, now sounded fragile. I don't know what to say. Malcolm met her gaze for a moment before responding. There's nothing you need to say, Mrs. Sinclair, just rest. She lowered her head, ashamed. The silence between them was interrupted when a flight attendant approached. Dr. Hayes, the medical team is already waiting outside to take Mrs. Sinclair to the hospital, she informed him. Malcolm nodded, stepping aside as the paramedics entered the cabin. Before being taken away, Margaret lightly grasped his arm. I was wrong, she admitted, her eyes filled with emotion. Please forgive me. Malcolm offered a small, understanding smile. Life has a strange way of teaching us lessons, doesn't it? Take care, Mrs. Sinclair. The passengers watched the scene in silence. Some, who had only observed the initial conflict, now looked at Malcolm with newfound respect. A man in the back murmured to another, "The irony of life." As Margaret was escorted off the plane, Malcolm picked up his carry-on bag and walked down the aisle without looking back. He didn't need recognition. His work was done. The aircraft door opened for him, but also for a new chapter in Margaret's life. One where, for the first time in a long time, she was forced to see beyond her own prejudices. This story shows us how life can surprise us in unexpected ways. Margaret Sinclair boarded that plane carrying prejudice and judgment, but she left with a lesson she would never forget. Malcolm Hayes, through his calm demeanor and professionalism, proved that character and competence have nothing to do with race or social class. In the end, we are all human, and sometimes it takes an extreme situation to open our eyes to our own limitations. And you, what did you think of this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? Leave your comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to Stories for You, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our heartfelt narratives. Share this story with someone who needs to reflect on the power of empathy and respect. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.